I'm so excited about this video's project because it is something I've been looking at building for a very long time now, and that is a life-size Plo Koon bust. I'm not even entirely sure what originally made me want to build this, but I think it was coming across these amazing looking files. And a couple of weeks ago, the makers of these files, 3Demon, actually reached out to me asking if I would ever be interested in working on something with them, and so I attempted to explain this rather wild idea that I've had of wanting to build this life-size Plo Koon bust, and they thought it was a super cool idea, so they very graciously provided me with the files and are funding this build. Seriously, they make a bunch of really cool stuff, so I would highly recommend checking out their work if you're into making any prop replicas, because there's a bunch of really interesting and unique files available. But anyway, now that I've explained what we are working on today, let's actually start building Jedi Master Plo Koon. The first thing was to actually get the pieces printed. I went into Mesh Mixer to attach some of the cut pieces back together to print as one piece, but ultimately decided to only print some modified face pieces in a top and bottom half as opposed to quarters, and leave the back of the head as it was. Other than the respirator pieces, all of the head pieces were printed on an Ender 3 V2 on a 0.4mm nozzle at 0.2mm layer heights. There's just so much amazing wrinkle texture and detail on this model that I wanted to print it at a slightly higher resolution than I might typically print a life-size piece like this. So my bin of fun here, these are all of the FDM pieces. Haven't cleaned them up or anything, I just basically threw them in here once they finished printing. So now I'm gonna actually take any support material off. This is probably not the best example because I'm pretty sure this did have quite extensive support material and it just came off when I was trying to get it off of the bed. But there are quite a few pieces that have just different support here and there. So I'm gonna clean all of those up and then get to rough sanding this so that we can start assembling some of these pieces. Now this model has a lot of texture and crevices, so I had to do most of this base level sanding by hand using, I believe, 100 grit sandpaper, just to initially try and smooth out as many of those layer lines as I possibly could, but I did eventually, for the larger head back pieces, bust out my handy, trusty foot callus remover sander thing. I have a whole video on it I will link here. This thing is amazing. It gets rid of layer lines so well, and it is obviously a lot faster than having to hand sand the whole thing, but did not get to use that a ton this project just because of the very natural shapes on this model. Not a lot of flat planes on this one. And here's what some of those sanded pieces looked like after. I'm not sure if the black filament is helping or hurting here, but the more gray areas are clearly the spots that I did get to sand down. And from there I did give it a couple of pretty generous coats of filler primer just to give me an initial base that I could see the more problematic areas where I was going to need to work on. And while I was waiting for that to dry, I actually grabbed the two head pieces to attach them. This model has an incredibly useful feature built into it, and that is these holes to help you line up the pieces during assembly. I'm sure it also helps with strength around the seam, but not having to worry and be so paranoid about if your pieces are actually lined up or not is my main interest here. And because of that, I just cut down some of these toothpicks into pieces and fit a couple into each hole so that the fit was nice and tight. For assembly, I used my typical 2 glue trick method, which, if you don't know, is where you put E6000 into like the central area of what you're gluing and then go around the outside with some super glue, because the E6000 tends to be a very strong bond, but then the super glue will help attach the pieces faster and it dries a lot quicker. So you don't have to sit there for like 24 hours holding on to these pieces. I let that sit for a bit, but then I started to add some Bondo onto that middle seam to try and help it disappear. Once the Bondo had dried, I sanded it down quickly before adding some filler primer onto that as well to make it match up with the other head pieces. So here's what the back head pieces are looking like. These have two, I would say, pretty thick, decent coats of filler primer on them, and there's still quite a lot of rough areas on definitely like the upper portions where there are just more visible layer lines. And so while these are still in 4 fairly manageably sized pieces, I'm going to sand this down again and then possibly look at putting some of my resin filler, brush that on, sand that again, and then maybe look at gluing the halves together, like this piece onto its half, maybe prime it again, and go from there. I just really don't want to put it together too fast when I still have a ton of sanding to do. Ideally, they would be pretty much good to go other than the one like central seam down the middle, just because it's going to be way more manageable to sand and handle. So yeah, that is the plan for those pieces. For my resin filler, it is just UV printer resin, typically a bottle that I'm trying to use up and or get rid of, mixed with, in this case, baby powder, although I did flip to fumed silica powder because somebody commented saying that would ideally be what you would mix resin with, which it is. Not that the baby powder didn't work, it just then very much smells like baby powder. And I typically brush on 2 to 3 coats per piece, just because it's better to go in thinner layers and build it up gradually. And it being UV resin means there's no dry time because you just cure it with a UV light. So immediately after adding the resin to those pieces, I sanded them down before then going ahead and gluing the left top and bottom piece together and the right top and bottom piece together. Of course, also still using the toothpicks and the 2 glue method. I let that sit for a bit before adding some spot putty to that seam as well. The Bondo is really to just pack in the gap between the 2 pieces, but I will always go over the seam with my UV resin mixture just because it helps blend that seam together way more perfectly than the Bondo on its own. Especially on a piece like this that has so many little crevices, there are a lot of areas that I really couldn't get the Bondo into well, and so the UV resin really helped to smooth that out. A piece that I haven't even talked about yet are these side mouth pieces. They go from like his ears to the respirator, and they were super simple. I just did a really quick sand and then immediately put resin on them, did a bit of filler primer, and they were good to go. Here are what the back pieces are looking like at the moment. They're still not great, but they're definitely much better. So I think I'm going to give both of them a really thorough sanding, and then possibly, depending on what they feel like, actually glue them together, because I think with like a pretty good sand that, other than like a few little problem areas, these probably would be okay to actually start assembling, and then I can work on the main back seam. But yeah, on camera the like slight texture to them might not really show up. It's mostly there's like some resin drips and some more like rough areas where you can clearly see that I've sanded. So overall, not too bad considering this actually isn't very many layers of like priming and stuff. After I did my typical Bondo sand, UV resin filler, and sand again deal, I went ahead with some more filler primer, essentially just to bring it back to one color so I could really see and check that everything looked good before I went ahead and attached the front of the head to the back. Which meant that after all of this time and work, the head was finally in one piece. But of course there was still that final seam, so it was back to the filler primer, sand, UV resin filler, and sand again deal. This is what it ended up looking like. Super clean and smooth. All of the seams I got to make completely disappear, which is why this next step might drive a bunch of you nuts, because I decided that it was a bit too smooth for the subject matter, and I wanted to add texture back into the model. And for this massive experiment, it was down to my handy resin filler and a sponge brush. I did use a bit of a thicker consistency than I might typically use for my resin mixture when smoothing prints, but other than that, I just took a sponge brush and dabbed it all over this model, and it worked so incredibly well at creating that skin texture. I cured it in fairly small sections just because I didn't want the resin to accidentally self-level itself, and I also avoided the spots on the ears, because in all of the reference those appeared to remain pretty smooth. This was such a simple way to build up a texture, so I'm definitely going to be using this technique in the future. And that was it for the head, other than finally cleaning up these resin printed pieces and doing a test fit after all of this time. I'd never seen the head fully in one piece until this moment. Also, all of the resin pieces were printed on my Anycubic Mono X. But you may be wondering, I thought you said this is going to be a life-size bust, and this is just the head. Well, I ended up Frankensteining this bust model together because I knew I didn't really need much. Mostly it was the neck I needed to have like a reasonable amount of wrinkle texture to it. But as for the shoulder and actual body, I knew I was covering in fabric anyway, so that wasn't a big issue. So this is what I came up with. And of course that needed to get 3D printed as well, so for this I used my CR10S with a 0.8mm nozzle, and it was printed in half pieces. I did end up roughly sanding it down before gluing the two halves together, and I did a bit of work on the seam just because I wasn't entirely sure how much you might see and how much it might make a difference. I really only needed to worry about the neck because that's really all you can see in the final model. And I finished that off with a round of filler primer, again, mostly for the neck because I knew I was going to need to paint that. The neck also got the resin filler texturizing to match the head, but I apparently didn't film that. But now that I have all of the parts built, it is time for the fun part, painting. I honestly used the inexpensive craft paint for 90% of the paint for this project. I did mix in a bit of actual airbrush paint just because it is a more watery and pigmented consistency already, and so it just kind of mixes well when you're trying to thin down the craft paint. And you can see here I'm mixing it up in a small cup because this is such a large model that I wanted to make sure I had a lot of the paint colors that I wanted to use for it pre-mixed in the right consistency, so I didn't have to try and remix the color again because I'm very particular, and if it was so much as a hair off color-wise, I was going to see it. And it's also just way more convenient to have a reasonable amount of the paint color pre-mixed so that you can just refill your airbrush with it and not have to stop painting and remix up more paint. So the first step in my painting routine for this project was to fully cover the model in this reddish rusty brown color. I wanted it to be pretty dark, and this was the color that I wanted in every single nook and cranny and wrinkle on this thing. The next step, which is what I'm going to call base coat number 2, was to take more of that actual lighter orange typical Plo Koon color and bring out the higher points on this model. But like I said again, this is a base coat, so if it is not perfect, do not worry. I wanted this paint job to have a ton of layers because that's what was going to give it such a realistic and dimensional look. It is skin, and skin has a lot of different colors and little things that look like they're buried underneath the skin. You will see at some point work on the scale vein texture thing that's going on his head. But actually, because of that is why I needed to bring up this base color to something lighter, because the veins that I was going to add to this were just going to blend in with the initial base rusty color. I did also just want to say, there were so many crevices to this thing that I was constantly manhandling it off camera to try and get to all of these little areas to make sure that everything looked like it kind of blended together and not just what I could actually see when using the helmet stand. But now it is time for what is easily the most nerve-wracking part of this paint job, which is the underscales, I'm going to call them. Here is a picture of dear old Master Plo, and if we zoom in to his head here, you can probably see this like veining texture going on, and I feel like a lot of people think that's what it is, you know, that you would draw it something like this, like randomized veins. But if you really look at it, it's way more uniform than random vein lines. The best way that I could describe it is almost like a circular diamond. So I ended up drawing on with my airbrush something that looked more like this. But I still kept it pretty natural and just filled in the shapes that the area was naturally creating, and I did vary the size a bit depending on the area because there is some size variation right like here when you get closer into the insets of the wrinkles. But I really just wanted to show that and explain it a little more in depth because I'm not actually sure how well it's going to come across while I do this with my airbrush, and I really think that this step made the paint job and just took it to an entirely other level of realism for the actual screen used mask and, you know, just in general what Plo Koon looks like. I did these scales with a very similar color to the color that I used for the initial base layer. I think I toned down the saturation a little so it was a little more brown, but that reddish dark rusty color is what I used. I also went back in with this while I was doing the scales into some of the crevices, especially on the dots on the ears, is what I'm going to call them for lack of a better term, for the masses on the sides of his head. And I know this is going to look quite crazy when you're done, but don't worry, it's going to get completely covered. But here's what mine looked like after like 2 hours of freehanding these scales onto it. A bit wild, but also pretty cool looking at the same time. Now it's time to start toning these scales down with some lighter orange. I did end up mixing my paint from here on out a slightly thinner consistency so it was more translucent, just so that I didn't accidentally cover up the scales too much, because I did again want to use a lot of different layers and slightly varying colors to really give it an organic look. But for this first pass of the orange, I pretty much covered all of the high points on the entire head. The next pass I did with a lightish cream color. Closer to the eye section, it's quite pale, and around the mouth and ears also appear to be a slighter, at the very least more desaturated orange color. So the cream was to lighten up some of those areas, but also to help desaturate and neutralize some of that more intense orange. I did use it very sparingly and lightly across some of the highest points on the other areas of the head as well. I went back and forth with a couple of different oranges, mostly to push back the scales into the paint job so they weren't so obvious and intense. And once I was happy with how everything looked, it was time to attempt to mimic the same technique on the neck portion to look like the entire thing actually matched and was part of the same organism. I knew the neck was going to be super covered though, so this was like the fast track speed paint job version of what the head got. Other than the fact that I basically could not see 95% of the neck that I needed to paint in any of the reference photos. So a lot of this was essentially just guesswork and using the same techniques that I did on the head, assuming that the neck probably looked about the same texture and color-wise. Now that all of the skin was painted, it was time to move on to the resin pieces. I started off with priming them with my typical airbrush primer that I love using on resin prints, this time in black because I wanted to dry brush all of these pieces, the bronze tone that they look like. So using a large and very mangy paintbrush, I just gently dry brushed the tops and highest points of all of the resin pieces. There's a lot of detail and recessed areas in these, so it really wasn't difficult to achieve that sort of dry brushed look and keep all of the recessed areas a darker color. I did a super quick and rough job on all of these pieces though, because I knew I was going to eventually add some black wash to all of it as well. The bronzy paint just looked way too pristine on its own, even with the super rough dry brushing, and it's so easy to add a wash on top of this, and it just gave it that perfect oil rubbed bronze look. It's also somewhat debatable what these pieces are actually supposed to be made out of, so overall this just gave it the right look. Now, because this mask was for a display piece, I was worried about possibly seeing the helmet pole and just generally through the holes in the respirator as well as the goggles, so I decided to put some black fabric behind it just to make it look nice and even and dark. Even if you were building this for a costume as it was originally designed, you'd probably want to add some sort of dark mesh just to help mask your actual face underneath it. I backed the goggles as well with the fabric, but I attached it to the inside of the head, not the goggles themselves. The next step was to actually attach the goggles and respirator to the head. For this I used a combination of super glue and hot glue just if I needed it to set faster than the super glue might have allowed. I also at some point, though apparently off camera, painted the circular parts that come off of the head's mouth bronze as well, because it's part of the respirator. One of the final bits of painting that I did was using this glorious chrome. I don't even know if you can classify this as paint, but it is amazing, and I used that on the tips of the little tentacle-y things because those attach to these parts on the respirator, and they are metal that goes into these parts and not actually part of the skin, I guess you could call it. But the final step for the head assembly was to actually attach these long parts of the respirator and the head tentacles to each other and then to the head. Now, while all of this head building and assembly was going down, my mom was working on the fabric portions for the bust. She's the costumer and sewing expert, I'm just the prop builder. The first costume piece that I did actually do some work on was this collar piece. The fabric was the perfect texture, but it was way too light, so I ended up painting it the right color. Now, this is like totally a valid way to change the color of fabric for a costume. I would not necessarily recommend doing this exact method if you were planning on wearing it, but this was for a bust, so it absolutely worked. I didn't even add fabric medium to the paint. It was just like really watered down acrylic paint in the right color. Once that had dried, it was time to start adding the costume pieces to the bust. Starting with the collar piece, I just glued that down front and back in any area that I thought it might accidentally show the undersculpt on the bust that I didn't paint and also didn't want to show. Next, I took a couple of pieces of the same fabric that was used for the outer Jedi robe and covered these ends. It was going to fit a lot better if I just really tightly covered the ends as opposed to trying to make the robe fit over this shape, especially because for the most part I just had my mom make me pretty loose end fitting pieces that I knew I was going to glue down and cut down and make it fit how I wanted on this bust. Which is why the next piece is this really measly little Jedi robe strip. None of these underpieces had to be very large or completed because everything was going to get covered up by this outer robe. This thing had an incredible amount of fabric because I made my mom make it with a fully functional hood. So I spent a lot of time playing around with it and folding it in places and just trying to get it to look natural. The bust works like a really fancy helmet stand, so there's a pole with an end cap for the head to sit on, and this one I specifically designed to fit on the inside of Plo's head. The final steps were to actually place the pole into the bust and then finally place the head onto the stand. And here you have the finished life-size Jedi Master Plo Koon bust.